Hello and welcome to NCODA's National Monthly Webinar. My name is Steven Zeiter and I'm a project manager with NCODA. We have some great speakers and many interesting topics in store, so I'm very excited to get started. I would like to review some features and controls of Zoom, our webinar platform. If you joined us by phone, you will only be able to listen to the webinar. If you joined us by computer or the Zoom mobile app, your mic will be muted by default. However, you are able to ask questions and contribute to the conversation in a few different ways. First, if you have a question that you would like to ask via message, please click on the Q&A option on your screen. If you would like to ask a question or contribute using your microphone, please select the Raise Hand option on your screen. It will then turn green and it will notify the host that you raised your hand. The host will then give you the option to unmute your mic. The host will then prompt you to unmute your mic during a designated period, allowing you to ask your question. As always, regarding mic etiquette, please mute your microphone if you are not speaking. Before we get into today's presentation, I wanted to share some great news. You can now find NCODA videos on both YouTube and Vimeo. The videos include highlights from past national meetings, as well as snippets from previous national monthly webinars, including PQI and Clinical Corner presentations. These videos are designed to allow all NCODA members to remain engaged. To see these videos, visit YouTube or Vimeo and type in the keyword NCODA. We have a full agenda today. Presenters from 8 different states will be speaking. First, our opening remarks will be delivered by Jake Dygert from South University School of Pharmacy. Next, our PQI clinical overview on Granisetron for chemo-induced nausea and vomiting by Latha Radhakrishnan. Summit Cancer Centers is our practice in focus this month. Natasha Heimbigner will talk about her practice. Chara Reed from DuPage Medical Group will give our Clinical Corner presentation on Venclexta for AML, sponsored by Genentech. Nora Hansen will provide us with a highlight recap of NCODA's most recent spring forum. Kathy Wu will discuss NCODA's recent impact with Be the Match. Rebecca Coravasi will talk about a recent NCODA student chapter-led Be the Match donor drive. Darren Luan from Yale New Haven Health will give our operational excellence presentation on sequencing from Nexavar to Stivarga in HCC, sponsored by Bayer. And finally, Matt Schultz will highlight NCODA's discussion board. First up to talk about our mission statement, vision statement, new member practices, and sponsors is Jake Dygert, president of NCODA's student chapter at South University School of Pharmacy in Columbia, South Carolina. Jake.
Thank you, Stephen. NCODA's mission is to advance the value of dispensing practices for oncology physicians. We will provide leadership, expertise, quality standards, and sharing of best practices with all members. We will deliver positive outcomes through collaboration with all stakeholders involved in the care of oncology patients. Our vision is to be the world leader in oral oncology by building a patient-centered, medically integrated community whose focus is to innovate the continuity of cancer care so that every patient receives the maximum benefit from their treatment. I would like to welcome the new practices that have joined since last month's webinar. Advocate Aurora Health in Illinois, CHI St. Joseph in Kentucky, Elder Care Pharmacy in Georgia, Option Care in New York, OSF Healthcare in Illinois, Penn Medicine Chester County Hospital in Pennsylvania, Sinai Health System in Illinois, Toro Infirmary Hospital in Louisiana, and the University of North Texas System College of Pharmacy in Texas. On behalf of NCODA, I would like to thank some of our newest annual platinum sponsors: Athenix, Beijing, Celgene, Novartis, Puma Biotechnology, and Seattle Genetics. Thank you for supporting NCODA. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge our sponsors for this month's national webinar, Genentech and Bayer. Genentech is sponsoring today's Clinical Corner presentation, and Bayer is sponsoring our Operational Excellence presentation today. Thank you for your support. Lastly, I'd like to discuss our growth. NCODA is growing every day, and we now have over 1,100 members and more than 350 practice sites. Working together, we can become stronger.
Thanks so much, Jake. Prior to our PQI clinical overview, I would like to invite Matt Schultz to talk about NCODA's PQI and PQI in Action initiatives. Matt.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. At NCODA, PQIs are very near and dear to our hearts. It is an important scientific document that delivers best practices to our healthcare professionals nationwide. To date, we've published 20 PQIs, and this year our goal is to publish at least 20 new PQIs. We are constantly seeking new authors and folks to help us review and improve those documents, so please go ahead and join today. Additionally, we have an initiative called the PQI in Action, which features a particular practice being highlighted in their use of the PQI. Currently, we're seeking practices who use the Regorafenib PQI and some others coming down the line. So if you're interested, please let us know. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt. Next up with our PQI clinical overview is Latha Radhakrishnan, clinical pharmacist at the University of Illinois Cancer Center. Latha will speak about the PQI that she wrote on Granisetron for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. Latha.
Thanks, Stephen. So today, as Stephen mentioned, I'll be talking about the Granisetron transdermal system or patch. The brand name is Sancuso. This is most certainly not a new product. It's actually been available on the market since September 2000, or sorry, FDA approved since September 2008. But perhaps more direction or more patient situations could direct our use in this product, and we could utilize this a little bit better. Also with the explosion, particularly in the oral oncolytics area in the space, there's more opportunities here to really utilize the patch to its fullest degree. So a little bit about the background. It was approved in 2008 for the prevention of nausea and vomiting in patients receiving moderately and or highly hematogenic chemotherapy for up to 5 days. So that is the indication for both oral and IV. Next slide, Stephen. So I think more direction is just needed based on clinical experience of where to consider using the transdermal system in certain patient situations. And the first bullet point of moderate to highly hematogenic oral multi-day chemotherapy, this is in fact where I really got my experience from in using it in patients that were starting on temozolomide at the 150 milligram per meter squared dose daily for 5 days back in 2010, 2011. So we would, start the Sancuso patch on these patients, and, it worked very well for those patients that were on temozolomide for 5 days. Also can be used for patients having, difficulty swallowing due to mucositis, tumor location, patients on IV chemotherapy plus radiation. So you think about your head and neck cancer patients, patients with issues with gut motility and absorption due to being on pain medications or tumor location. Of course, your patients that have adherence issues. And then also I've used this in patients with refractory nausea and vomiting despite appropriate preventative antiemetics. So that's another area where the patch can be utilized. Next slide. So with the PQI process, upon receipt of an order for Granisetron patch, just ensuring that it's appropriate to use. So again, using it in moderately hematogenic and highly hematogenic, either IV or oral chemotherapy. Making sure to check the start date for the chemotherapy cycle, because you do have to instruct the patient to apply the patch 24 to 48 hours prior to receiving chemotherapy. The patient needs to wear the patch for the entirety of when the chemotherapy is either being infused or being administered orally, and remove at least 1 day after chemotherapy has been completed. Make sure to verify prescription coverage, and Kyowa Kirin has a patient RX solutions hub that is excellent in assisting in this process. For patients that have difficulty keeping the patch on, so thinking about your patients that are having hot flashes and they're sweating, so the use of the medical adhesive tape or Tegaderm on the edges could assist so that the patch stays in place. And even though this is used in the preventative measures, you do need to make sure that a patient has like rescue medication like prochlorperazine as well in the event that they are nauseous. Next slide, Stephen. So patient-centered activities, making sure, to talk about application instructions, and we won't go through that, but avoiding sunlight and heating sources. So that can affect the efficacy as well as cause some skin issues. So making sure to talk to them about it. Constipation was the big toxicity or the toxicity that was noticed. So talking to them about using a stimulant laxative as well as a stool softener. And then calendars would assist in application and the removal of the patch, and making sure patients are covering their skin for another 10 days after the patch is removed to avoid potential skin reactions is another important education piece. And if there are any financial assistance issues, using Patient RX solution. And one thing that's really great, and I know I'm running out of time, is the Sancuso patch replacement program. If the chemotherapy is delayed and the patient has already put the patch on, there is a replacement program available. Next slide. And these are just the references available, and the full PQI is available on the webpage. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Latha. And what we'll do is we'll open it up for questions for our members. So feel free to use the chat or the Q&A boxes, and we'll field your questions. If you do have a question, you don't think of it now, but it comes to you in the next 5-10 minutes, or even before the end of the webinar, feel free to still send it, and we will definitely connect with Latha to get you an answer. Now, Latha, for our members out there listening, what are some of the main takeaways from today's PQI? I know you gave a high-level overview, but if you had to, say what are the main takeaways, what would those be?
I think identifying those patients, we're in the NCODA space and oral oncolytics, and there have been quite a few approvals relatively recently with more oral oncolytics in the moderately to highly hematogenic space. So PARP inhibitors, Lonsurf is another example. So and temozolomide, of course, that's been there. But there are quite a few, and if they're getting multi-day treatment and they're having difficulty swallowing or they have issues with adherence, then perhaps the Granisetron transdermal patch would be a great option for those patients. So identification.
Awesome, Latha. Thank you. And again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat or Q&A box, and we'd be happy to get those to Latha. Thank you again, Latha. And as you mentioned, the PQI is available on NCODA's website, ncoda.org/PQI. It is my pleasure to introduce our practice in focus this month, Summit Cancer Centers in Washington State. Representing Summit is oncology pharmacist Natasha Heimbigner. Natasha will speak a little bit about her practice and why she joined NCODA, and how her and her team are partnering with NCODA now, and how they would like to continue to partner with NCODA moving forward.
So at Summit Cancer Centers, we have currently 4 locations: Spokane, the Spokane Valley, Post Falls, and down in Meridian, Idaho. In our practice, we have 6 oncologists, 2 nurse practitioners, 1 physician assistant, 2 surgeons, 1 pharmacist, myself, 3 IV technicians, 1 oral technician, and 60 ancillary staff. We do everything from bone marrow biopsies, chemo, radiation, surgery, imaging, financial support, and our medically integrated dispensary. Our medically integrated dispensary boasts 1 pharmacist, myself, and 1 oral technician, Alicia Barnes. We service all 4 clinics utilizing a courier or transport to get all of the medications to our varying locations. Our goal is a 24-hour turnaround and a $0 copay on all new starts with our MID. By handling the oral medications from beginning to end, we're able to provide excellent care at a high level for all of our patients. I heard about NCODA through another member, Jen O'Doherty from Omaha, and she encouraged me to join NCODA. Being in a similar practice setting, thrown into oncology, very similar to my own situation, she boasted about all of the great things that NCODA could bring to our practice. When I joined, I wasn't sure about how NCODA would help, but it's been an amazing organization for us, helping with PQIs, which we distribute to all of our providers. Our nursing staff also use them as well. It's been a wonderful organization to ask questions and field them to other people who are dealing with the same things that we do every day. Our future challenges, we expect, as always, challenges with reimbursement, going beyond the first fill, and how to avoid those awful DIR fees. And we expect that NCODA will be a huge partner in that, as they already have. And that's Summit Cancer Centers.
Awesome, Natasha. Thank you so much. And for those listening, Summit Cancer Center's Practice and Focus application will be available on the NCODA website. It's available currently right now under our Practice and Focus section. Natasha, thank you again. Shara Reed, Manager of Pharmacy Services at DuPage Medical Group in Illinois, will now deliver our Clinical Corner presentation sponsored by Genentech. This month's Clinical Corner presentation is on Venclexta for AML. Chara.
Thanks, Stephen. So today we're going to talk about Venclexta and AML. I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to go through this quickly. And of course, any questions you have, please just type them through, and if I can't answer them, I can get back to you. Our objectives today are to identify the key differences between the treatment of AML and CLL with Venclexta, recognize common adverse effects and drug interactions in patients being treated with Venclexta, and to formulate a treatment plan, including Venclexta in patients with AML. I will say this talk is not about CLL, but because I know there's the dosing is vastly different between treating AML and CLL. It was important when I was putting these slides together and talking to Genentech and my MSL, they as an organization really want to make sure that we're highlighting the differences, even though we're not talking about treating AML or treating CLL. So in AML, it's a cancer of the hematopoietic precursor cells, interferes with normal production of blood cells, often leading to genetic mutations in the immature precursor cells, and AML is the most common acute leukemia in adults and does account for 1% of cancer deaths in the U.S. Patients generally present with anemia, pale skin, bruising, headache. The diagnosis does require a bone marrow biopsy. So looking at AML, these hematopoietic cell transplant is typically what, is kind of our first line of treatment for these patients. But for various reasons, some patients are not eligible for a transplant. One can be over the age of 75, a low forced vital capacity, also a low serum creatinine or low creatinine clearance, or a low ejection fraction. So these patients aren't eligible for our first line therapy of a cell transplant. And the eligibility for patients who are eligible or not eligible for cell transplant, it's various. So there's just not one single marker we look at. The physician will make those decisions based on various factors listed. So Venclexta, it's indicated in the treatment of newly diagnosed AML with azacitidine, decitabine, or low-dose cytarabine in patients over the age of 75 or with various other comorbidities that preclude us from using intensive reduction therapy. Prior to initiation, we do want to check those white blood counts. And it's very, very important that these patients get pre-medicated with hydration in the infusion setting, just so we can help reduce that risk of TLS in these patients. So the Venclexta mechanism of action, it inhibits BCL2, leading to tumor cell apoptosis. The BCL2 is overexpressed in AML, and so that overexpression allows the cancer cells to evade apoptosis, and Venclexta binds selectively to BCL2, freeing up those pro-apoptotic proteins that initiate the programming of the cell death. So therefore, it's inhibiting the Venclexta inhibits that apoptosis, or helps with that apoptosis. So there were, in the interest of time, I didn't have time to go over both the two different clinical trials. So I'm focusing on the clinical trial that got Venclexta approved in a phase 1/2 study, and it was used in low dose cytarabine. But just to be aware, there is another study that did approve it to be used in the azacitidine and the decitabine treatment arm. So there are various doses. We will highlight that, but for time's sake, I won't go through the both arms of that study. So this study had a population of patients were greater than or equal to the age of 65 with previously untreated AML, and they were ineligible for standard induction therapy and had an ECOG of 0 to 2. The treatment arm looked at actually 3 different doses of Venclexta plus cytarabine. They looked at 400 milligrams, 600 milligrams, and 800 milligram arm. I will say that the dose that came out in the FDA guidelines is the 600 milligrams. So for if a patient's getting cytarabine, so we're not definitely not using 800 milligrams, and 400 milligrams is only approved in another treatment arm, and I'll talk about that here in a second. The primary endpoint was safety, dose-limiting toxicities, and kinetic markers. So one of the important things that shook out in this trial, which got it approved so quickly, was that there was a really short time to response. So in these patients, the median time to response was 1 month, and the median time to best response was 2.6, so 2.5 months. So that's actually, unusual that we get a drug that works so quickly in this AML setting. And if you look at the patients who got a response, at the top of the slide is the total response rate. So these patients of all patients, 62% of patients responded. If you split out the intermediate risk patients and the high risk patients, the high risk patients responded at a 76% rate as opposed to a 47% rate. But so it's still a really good rate of response for these patients. And there's a breakdown there of a partial response, a complete response, which actually rendered these patients, they didn't have to get a transplant. And then there was a partial response. So they were in remission, but not with the total, they were in incomplete bone recovery. Moving to the next slide. The other important thing about the medication is they looked at patients who had mutations, if there was a difference, if a patient had a FLT3 mutation or IDH1/2 mutation, and after the end of the trial, they noticed that it did not matter. It was mutation agnostic who responded. So it didn't matter if the patients had the mutations or not, the FLT3 or IDH1/2, they still responded to drug. And you can see here, there's a slide here that shows those response rates, and the duration of response has actually not even been reached yet. So moving, next slide. So we're going to go over the adverse reactions with the Venclexta 600 milligrams. It is a small subset of patients here. The N was only 61. The most common side effects are the nausea, the hypokalemia, the fatigue, the diarrhea. But if you look at the total, we only listed on the slide any of the grade patients who had all grades greater than 30% is what I included. So just the top reactions, and I would just tell providers and practitioners to treat these patients according to your practice guidelines based on what you would normally do for any of these drug interactions for an oral medication. So the management of drug interactions, it's important. If you look at the red, those are the CLL/SLL. These drugs are actually, the CYP3 inhibitors are contraindicated if patients have the CLL or SLL diagnosis. So we put that in, even though that's not, the point of our topic today. In AML, you actually can use these CYP3 inhibitors. You just have to dose reduce. So it's important to understand, though, that is a different indication than if you're treating CLL. And CLL, these CYP3 inhibitors are actually contraindicated, and we would not use them with Venclexta. If the patient has a moderate CYP3A or PGP inhibitor, you can reduce the Venclexta dose by 50%. So Venclexta dosing, at the top, it's a different ramp up in AML versus CLL. So you're going to start at 1 tablet on day 1, 2 on day 2, 4 on day 3. If they're getting azacitidine or decitabine, they'll end up at 400 milligrams daily. If they're in the low dose cytarabine treatment, then they'll get 600 milligrams per day. But just remember that ramp up is only 3 days in AML, very, very different than CLL. CLL has a 5-week ramp up, and I just want to be sure that nobody mixes that up. Next slide. And then we added a slide here because Genentech has really generous, financial support programs for patients. I saw something, I think yesterday, on a patient that was having a hard time getting their Venclexta approved. Genentech can work with you, and we did list those websites, so you can use those in helping patients decrease the cost or look for free drug or foundation assistance. The organization will help with that. Last takeaway points, the treatment differences between AML versus CLL is there are definite differences in the drug interaction dose adjustments and the up titration of dosing. So just keep that in mind, that they're very different depending on what you're treating. Really important that kind of sets Venclexta aside is that there's a short median response to time, 1 month versus 4 months in some of the other traditional orals. And the response indicates a greater portion of patients that may become transfusion independent. So, and the treatment response is independent of genetic mutations. And any questions?
Great, Chara, thanks. So we'll open it up to our members. Remember, please feel free to enter any questions or comments in the Q&A or chat box. So we'll pause for a moment. And also did want to mention that NCODA also has some financial assistance information regarding Venclexta on our website under the financial assistance tab. So Chara, it looks like we did have a question come in. The question reads, can you speak briefly on your experience with Venclexta and patient response, if applicable?
Yeah, so I will tell you, we have a couple patients on Venclexta right now, and I know there was kind of a big worry about TLS, and not that we don't discount that, but we haven't seen it. So I don't know if that's answering the person's question, but our patients are doing, our 2 patients who are on drug are doing actually really well, and we. Right now, I don't have any patients who we treated with AML. These were patients in the CLL. We did their dose ramp up, and they were fine.
Thanks, Chara.
We did obviously monitor them appropriately, but no issues.
Okay. And we did have another comment come in, and a member wanted to know if these slides would be made accessible to our members. While the slide deck themselves, no, feel free to visit our YouTube and Vimeo channels and the NCODA website, as we will post these specific presentations that you can go and take a look back on, so you can view the slides and the recording. So Chara, thank you so much.
Sure.
Before we recap our successful spring forum, I would like to share with you all a video highlight from the forum. I would like to preface the video by saying that depending on your Wi-Fi connectivity strength, the video may appear pixelated. If you would like to view the entire video via our video library, please visit the link above or vimeo.com and enter the keywords 2019 Spring Forum Highlights.
Our tagline at NCODA, as you've seen, is passion for patients. That's what we're all about. There's 2 guiding values that define NCODA. First is being patient-centered, and 2 being collaborative.
You know, at the end of the day, it's about patient care. Why are you doing what you're doing? You're doing it because you want to take care of your patients. That's what you're doing. You know, I've heard stories. I walked in this morning, heard a story about my wife has cancer, and these are the people who took care of her. And now she's recovered. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. That's what we go to work for every day. That's what you go to work for.
And again, if you would like to view that video in its native form, feel free to visit Vimeo.com and type in the tagline 2019 Spring Forum Highlights. Nora Hansen, Spring Forum co-chair and pharmacy technician at Progressive Care at Illinois Cancer Specialists in Illinois, will recap NCODA's successful Spring Forum. Nora.
Thanks, Stephen. Good afternoon, everyone. So our Spring Forum was very successful. We had the highest attendance rate. It was so far the largest gathering of NCODA members thus far. We had 3 tracks. We had 27 sessions, the most CE we've offered so far. 28 posters were presented. The slides from the NCODA Spring Forum are available at ncoda.org/forum for all members to see. So we had a great time. I hope you would consider coming to our next forum, or summit, I should say, in the fall at the Gaylord Palms in Orlando. It looks beautiful. I've checked out the website. So I hope to see you all October 24th to 26th.
Thanks so much, Nora. As you may know, NCODA has partnered with Be the Match over the last few years. The Be the Match registry is operated by the National Marrow Donor Program, a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to creating an opportunity for all patients to receive the marrow or umbilical cord blood transplant they need when they need it. It is the largest and most diverse donor registry in the world. Kathy Oob, Chief Operating Officer at Pontchartrain Cancer Center in Louisiana, will now talk about NCODA's recent support of our nonprofit partner, Be the Match. Kathy.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your continued support and participation in Be the Match, which raised over $3,400 at the NCODA Spring Forum. I'd like to share a recent email we received from Libby Wanner at Be the Match. The gifts given because of NCODA's efforts directly impact the patients we serve. Because of you, we are able to add 8 potential life-saving donors to the Be the Match registry. We're also able to help families pay for critical transplant costs and fund life-saving research. Thank you again for your continued support. And guys, that's because of you. The member practices and our sponsors, you guys made that happen, and thank you. Ray Bailey and I are honored to chair such an important initiative and look forward to our continuing work with Be the Match to create the NCODA Be the Match media kits to help member practices and student chapters organize donor drives. Our goal is to have these kits ready for summer, and once they are available, our next goal will be to have 15 donor drives and add 45 to 60 potential life-saving donors to the Be the Match registry by Spring Forum 2020. So I'm throwing down the gauntlet, guys. And if you are interested in hosting a donor drive, please contact us at contact@ncoda.org. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks so much, Kathy. Earlier this month, a few members of NCODA's professional student organization at the University of Rhode Island College of Pharmacy held a Be the Match donor drive. Rebecca Coravasi will now speak about the success of the drive. Rebecca.
Thank you, Stephen. So as Stephen said, I'm Rebecca. I'm the chapter president at the University of Rhode Island's professional student organization for NCODA. On the 7th of March, so a couple days after Spring Forum, we went together with different student organizations. We held a donor drive. We had a link for students to be able to sign up to get the swab kit. I gave Stephen the number 11 because that was the number that I was told, but we had a student meeting last night and I heard that it's actually 20. So we might want to boost our goal, Kathy, because I think that people are really willing to sign up for these swab kits. And so the next step, other than trying to do another drive, is we're actually having a meeting for students to do the swab kits together so that we can make sure that they're done properly and get sent to Be the Match as soon as possible. It was really successful. In the picture on the top right, we actually have in the middle at the top row is Emily Carroll. She is working with the Quality Standards Committee. We have committee liaisons for each of the committees at NCODA, and she actually was just nominated for Director of Communications last night. So next year she will be, she's a 5th-year student pharmacist. She's going to be working directly with the communications that go out. It was very easy to host a donor drive, so if you think it's a little bit too much work, it really isn't. It was extremely easy, and people were really enthusiastic about doing it.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. And we're glad to hear that that number went up. And absolutely, hopefully we can meet the lofty goal of that Kathy set. So thank you both. Darren Luan, clinical oncology pharmacist at Yale New Haven Health in Connecticut, will now deliver our Operational Excellence presentation sponsored by Bayer. This month's Operational Excellence presentation is on sequencing from Nexavar to Stivarga in HCC. Darren.
So thanks for the introduction, Stephen. I just wanted to go into, since I have a little less than 10 minutes now, so going into reviewing HCC or hepatocellular carcinoma. So just reminding us that HCCs, they're a really highly lethal group of cancers. This is the most common type being hepatocellular carcinoma. The SEERS database this year has estimated that there will be about 42,000 new diagnoses of liver cancer and intrahepatic bile duct cancer, so things like cholangiocarcinomas in the US, along with 31,000 deaths. The key statistic here is that this group of diseases is going to be the fastest rising cause of cancer-related deaths in the United States. And it's also, if you look at the overall data, looking at worldwide data, it's the 4th leading cause of cancer-related deaths worldwide. Next slide, please. I wanted to present a summary of the current NCCN guidelines for the management of metastatic HCC. Here we have organized it into whether it's recommended as first line versus subsequent therapy, as well as the NCCN categorization in terms of the strength of the recommendation, category 1 being the strongest with regards to evidence. Now, in the history of the treatment of HCC, there were essentially no therapies that existed or were FDA approved at all for patients with this disease at all until the first drug was approved in 2008. That medication was Sorafenib. Afterwards, there was almost a 10-year lull where there were no agents approved for patients who had failed Sorafenib, unfortunately. However, within the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen an amazing surge of new data leading to the recommendations that you can see here. In the remainder of this presentation, we'll briefly touch upon Sorafenib, and we'll be focusing on the first agent that was ever approved for patients with HCC who had progressed on Sorafenib, and that was Regorafenib. The decision for which of these agents to use once patients progress in Sorafenib should really be individualized on a patient-specific basis, but we won't go over that because that's beyond the scope of this presentation. Now, Sorafenib, again, this is the first agent ever approved for advanced stage HCC. This is what we call an oral multi-tyrosine kinase inhibitor, or TKI. Specifically, Sorafenib targets RAF signaling, vascular endothelial growth factor, platelet-derived growth factor, and KIT. These various targets have a number of functions, but the essential result of blocking these cellular pathways is the inhibition of angiogenesis, as well as having direct anti-proliferative effects on tumor cells. Next slide, please. I wanted to show you all the landmark SHARP trial very briefly. This was a randomized placebo-controlled trial that randomly assigned 602 patients with advanced HCC to receive Sorafenib versus placebo. The primary endpoint was overall survival, and this was significantly longer in the patients receiving Sorafenib. This was 10.7 months versus 7.9 months. This led to the FDA approval of Sorafenib for HCC and its use as really the primary systemic therapy for years for these patients with advanced HCC. Next slide, please. 8 years later, took 8 years, which is a really long time in oncology, new data finally emerged for a new agent, which is Regorafenib. This is a really similar drug to Sorafenib in that it's another multi-targeted tyrosine kinase inhibitor. While reviewing this table, it can be seen that there are a lot of similar targets to Sorafenib, including VEGF, stromal, and other oncogenic receptor tyrosine kinase that again has the overall anti-angiogenic properties as well as anti-proliferative properties. In addition to this, studies in vivo reported that the drug can inhibit that CSF1R and this reduces tumor-associated macrophages, a factor implicated in the tumor-specific immune response and in tumor growth overall. Next slide, please. Now, the study that led to the approval of Regorafenib in patients with advanced ACC was called the RESOURCE trial. It was published in 2017. It was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial that investigated Regorafenib versus placebo in patients who had documented disease progression on Sorafenib. Importantly, these patients had to have tolerated Sorafenib, which they defined as taking at least 400 milligrams per day for 20 of the last 28 days of treatment. In addition, and this may be difficult to find, but in addition, patients had to have relatively preserved hepatic function, Child-Pugh class A. Obviously, patients were excluded if they had permanently discontinued Sorafenib due to toxicity and if they had ever received any other type of systemic therapy for HCC. They dosed Regorafenib at a standard dose, which is 160 milligrams once daily for 3 out of every 4 week cycles. Next slide, please. Quickly going over through the results, here's the survival curve that demonstrates the primary endpoint, overall survival. After a median follow-up of 7 months, median overall survival was about 10.6 months in the Regorafenib arm versus 7.8 months in the placebo arm, which was statistically significant. Next slide, please. Regorafenib demonstrated a reduction in the risk of progression or death with a 3.4-month progression-free survival versus 1.5 months with placebo. Additionally, Regorafenib was superior to placebo in all of the efficacy endpoints, such as overall response, disease control rate, time to progression, as you can see here. One of the other important key endpoints was the time from start of Sorafenib to death in the RESOURCE trial. They looked at this between the two groups, and it was 26 months for patients who got Regorafenib versus only 19.2 months in patients receiving placebo. The side effects of Regorafenib were generally, as expected. Medications that target VEGF have a very common spectrum of adverse effects. They commonly experience things like hypertension, fatigue, and more rare complications such as bleeding, delayed wound healing, and gastrointestinal perforation. Given that Regorafenib targets a number of different targets, it does have other significant adverse effects. And this includes things like hand-foot syndrome, diarrhea, mucositis, and very rarely severe hepatotoxicity. I've listed out some of the more significant toxicities that were described in the RESOURCE trial as well as other trials that had studied Regorafenib as well. Next slide, please. Given this positive data, the FDA has approved Regorafenib for the treatment of patients with advanced HCC previously treated with Sorafenib. It's important to identify patients who would be candidates for treatment. So ideally, this means that there are patients who have tolerated Sorafenib well, given that these two drugs share many of the same adverse effects. Additionally, patients should have relatively preserved hepatic function as well as performance status based on ECOG or Karnofsky. Next slide, please. So when identifying a patient who may be a candidate for Regorafenib, one of the advantageous resources that we have available are our specialty pharmacy services. Now, these are patients who are really good candidates because, for example, our patients who are on Regorafenib commonly have these prescriptions sent to our specialty pharmacies. We use either our own specialty pharmacy or pharmacies recommended by their insurance companies. These have a number of advantages that really include having a higher familiarity with these rarely used medications, and as a result, better able to provide counseling and ongoing education as these patients receive therapy. They also are able to help with the financial toxicities of these medications, perhaps referring patients to financial counselors or medication assistance programs. There's an extensive list of specialty pharmacies around the country, and Bayer has helpfully listed many of them in the link provided here on this slide. Next slide, please. Specialty pharmacists and providers caring for patients taking Regorafenib should be familiar with the adverse effects that we have already discussed and how to monitor for them. A lot of institutions have their own monitoring parameters, but I have summarized general recommendations in this table. Monitoring liver function closely when patients start therapy due to the rare possibility of hepatotoxicity, monitoring WBCs, hemoglobin hematocrit, platelets for the risk of myelosuppression, and also closely monitoring for any development of hypertension during therapy. Patients are also closely assessed for the development of any hand-foot syndrome, bleeding, or any of these other serious adverse effects that are listed here in the slide. One of the vital things that patients must also be monitored for is adherence, since remember that this is an oral medication. Next slide, please. If patients do develop toxicities while on regorafenib, typically dose modifications or temporarily holding the medication are sufficient to manage these adverse effects. If dose modifications are done, doses are typically reduced in 40 milligram increments. Remember, these tablets are in 40 milligram tablets anyways, with the lowest recommended dose being 80 milligrams. Some of the other important pearls, making sure that patients are taking regorafenib with water and a low-fat containing meal at about the same time each day. If patients do forget to take their medication, they can take it as soon as they remember, unless it's within 12 hours until their next dose. Next slide, please. And then finally, for my last slide, I just wanted to provide a summary of a lot of the great resources that are available to these patients getting regorafenib. Bayer offers what's called the REACH program, which provides nurse counselors for any medication questions, as well as educational materials. They also offer financial access counselors who can help with benefit verification. For privately insured patients, there is a $0 copay program that can assist with high copays, and the link is here. Finally, a lot of specialty pharmacies, including my specialty pharmacy, has the ability to refer patients for patient assistance programs for any patients who do qualify, perhaps those who are uninsured or underinsured. And they can qualify for up to 12 months of free drugs. Just to give a small success story, for example, like my specialty pharmacy works very closely with a number of pharmaceutical companies in getting free drug for patients, and they managed to save well over $12 million in the past year in getting free drug for patients. So it's a very helpful program. And then next slide, please. And with that, that actually concludes me going as fast as I can, and I would be happy to answer any questions at this time.
Great, Darren, thank you. So as always, we'll open it up for questions. The Q&A box or chat box, feel free to utilize the raise hand function as well. So we'll give that just a few seconds. And I do want to mention, Darren, you did provide a great slide regarding resources. As always, NCODA, our financial assistance tab available on our website, has great financial assistance links for both Nexavar and Stivarga. Again, that's on the NCODA website under the financial assistance tab. So we'll give it a few minutes, Darren. Looks like we got a question. The question reads, are you using the ramp-up recommendations in the PI?
The ramp-up recommendations in the PI. Typically, so with our patients with colorectal cancer, so those the ramp-up recommendations with colorectal cancer, and this is honestly, in my practice setting, where we use regorafenib a lot more commonly. That's probably one reason, is because colorectal cancer is more common. And that ramp up, I believe, is 80 milligrams once daily, escalated weekly to the goal. In those patients, absolutely yes. We have typically used that, and typically my attendings will actually stay at the lower doses a lot of the time. With HCC, I can't honestly say we have a huge amount of experience yet with using the ramp up. We have one primary oncologist who deals with most of our HCCs, and I've seen her do a little bit of both, depending on the performance status of the patient in question. This is, I think, where our practice can be somewhat of an art rather than a science, because we haven't really forced our oncologists to do the same thing for every patient. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Darren. And for our members out there, can you briefly summarize in terms of identifying the patient, some of the clinical pearls that you would look for identifying someone who you think would be a candidate for this sequencing?
Absolutely. So, for the most part, especially with our current practice settings, most of the patients with advanced HCC, they're going to start with sorafenib. I don't really have many patients on lenvatinib. There's not a lot of clinical experience in this indication as of yet. Once patients progress on this, there are a lot of questions on where you can go next. One option, obviously, there's a little dust data at this point for this, but there are the checkpoint inhibitors, which have shown a lot of promise in other disease states, such as melanoma, RCC, and a few others. However, there is a substantial population of patients who may not be appropriate candidates for those drugs. For example, patients with rheumatologic diseases, just other autoimmune diseases at baseline. Those are patients who would probably be a bad idea to use a checkpoint inhibitor right away. And so a lot of these patients are the ones, again, those who tolerated sorafenib well, have relatively preserved hepatic function. These are going to be the perfect patients to get some of these second-line PKIs, especially regorafenib.
Great, Darren. Thank you again. And as always, we will be fielding questions throughout the remainder of the webinar. So if you do have a question, again, feel free to enter it in the chat box or Q&A box, and we can get that question. If not by the end of this webinar, we can definitely get your questions to any presenter that you ask based on, in this case for Darren. But Darren, thank you so much again. The presentation was very great.
Thank you.
Are you looking for ways to take advantage of your NCODA membership in 2019? Here at NCODA, we pride ourselves on collaborating with our members. Here are some ways you can become an active participant within NCODA. There are 7 great committees that are always looking to add active participants. NCODA can also assist with setting up Be the Match donor drives at your practice, as we discussed earlier. If you want to learn more about how you can get involved in NCODA committees and initiatives, or how you can host a Be the Match donor drive, please visit ncoda.org or email us at contact@ncoda.org. Matt Schultz will now talk about a great platform available to all NCODA members to ask questions, contribute to the conversation, and collaborate. The platform is called NCODA Discussions. Matt.
Thanks, Stephen. The discussion board is an easy way for us all to connect with colleagues throughout the year. As you know, NCODA is a unique membership organization. We have not only pharmacists, but also physicians, advanced practice providers, nurses, technicians, practice administrators, the list goes on and on. It really represents a wealth of potential connections and valuable information. You can connect most easily via our website after logging in. You'll find it listed under Member Resources and Discussion Board. Here we can stay current with hot topics in oncology in the time between our 2 national meetings. We do encourage you to share your stories on this medium. It will help us identify potential gaps in patient care in a very quick and collaborative fashion. Topics include clinical management issues, overcoming particular insurance barriers, questions about certification, credentialing, accreditation, really any topic in oncology care today. We can share our best practices here with the larger group and help to improve care nationwide. When starting a topic, be sure to check the box in the lower left-hand corner there that says notify me of follow-up replies via email. That way you'll be in tune with who's replying and what's happening with your particular topic. As we move forward, look forward to future IT upgrades in this service to make it even smoother. And by all means, start a topic today. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. And thank you to all of our speakers for their great discussions and presentations today. Thanks again to our Clinical Corner sponsor, Genentech, and our Operational Excellence sponsor, Bayer. Last but not least, thank you to all of our members. Your continued participation and support is vital in our quest to improve patient care. If you have any questions about anything that was discussed today, please email contact@ncoda.org. As I mentioned earlier, the video recording will be available on the NCODA website for this webinar and select presentations like our Clinical Corner, Operational Excellence, PQI, and Practice in Focus. Our next national monthly webinar is on Thursday, April 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern. We hope you can join us. From all of us at NCODA, thanks for joining and enjoy the rest of your day.